Hello, and welcome back to Plantopia. Plantopia is the plant health podcast of the American Phytopathological Society, and I'm your host, Matt Kasson. I'm an associate professor of forest pathology and mycology at West Virginia University. This is the 7th episode of Season 4 of Plantopia, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Terence Mhora, Senior Global R&D Scientist at FMC Agricultural Solutions. Dr. Mhora received his BS in Applied Biology and Biochemistry from the National University of Science and Technology in Zimbabwe, a Master's of Science in Plant Pathology from the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and a PhD in Plant and Soil Science from the University of Delaware. Dr. Mhora has worked on diverse disease pathosystems, including fungal diseases of sugarcane at the South African Sugarcane Research Institute in Durban, South Africa, on downy mildew of lima bean in Delaware, and tobacco diseases in Zimbabwe. Since 2018, Terry has worked as a part of FMC's fungicide discovery pipeline, where he has been able to leverage his experiences with fungi and oomycetes to develop solutions for diverse diseases and improve food safety and production. Outside his primary role as scientist, he serves as a secretary and board member of Healthy Foods for Healthy Kids, a Delaware NGO, and has been involved with various aspects of the American Phytopathological Society, both as a Potomac Division member and at the national level. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you for having me, Matt. I'm glad to be here.
It's great to have you on. I started hosting Plantopia in January of this year, and you're really my first industry guest. We've had a lot of people representing various career stages of academia. We've had some federal government employees, but you're my first person to come on representing someone that came up through plant pathology and moved into industry. So exciting times for you to catch us up on life outside of the academic and government pipelines. You're from Zimbabwe, is that correct?
Yes, I am. I'm from the southern part of Zimbabwe in a city called Bulawayo.
And for those of you listening that are less familiar with Africa, Zimbabwe is in southern Africa. It's bordered to the south by South Africa, and it's got Mozambique to the east, Zambia to the north, and Botswana to the west, right? So very close to South Africa. Now, what was life like growing up there? What was your experience, and how did those experiences shape your interest in agriculture?
So I grew up in the second largest city of Zimbabwe, and that is Bulawayo or Bulawayo, depends on your pronunciation. It's a little bit tough. But I grew up I would call it suburbia, but that's the equivalent of suburbia here in the US. I went to a local school that was there for primary education. And from there, I went to high school in a totally different province where I was in boarding school. So contrary to the US where boarding school is luxurious, it's different for us. It's more a place where people will go for the sake of being more focused on education and sport, and it just takes you away from home and you're in a more focused environment. And from there, I went to university in a college that's right by where I used to live, so the National University of Science and Technology, and I did a degree in applied biology and biochemistry. As part of an internship within that program, I worked for an organization that does research on tobacco, and that was my first encounter with plant pathology. So I worked on Rhizoctonia, a pathogen that infects tobacco, and I also worked with GMO detection. So I worked with identifying if we had any genetically modified genes or sequences in crops that were bound for import or export. So that's what I did for my internship. And as part of my honors project, I worked on a toxicology project. And on that research project, we had to find a way of using snail enzymes to develop biomarkers for pesticide exposure. And so that gave me some insight into science and more agricultural-based science. And that's where my passion began in that field. So that's how I grew up.
Yeah, so it seems like your first real experiences came during your time at the university in that regard.
From a science perspective, yes.
Right.
Growing up, we had a plot of land where we grew mostly corn, a few melons here and there, okra that my mom loves. I really don't like it, slimy. But that was my exposure to farming. We had a large garden and everything was pretty manual. It was tough to do. But after a couple of years of droughts, especially in the mid-2000s, that's when I also realized how important farming was for food security as well. And so that gave me that motivation to do science there.
Now, I know we'll talk a little bit more about sugarcane here in a moment. I know sugarcane's a really important crop in there. Maize too, cassava, tobacco, among some others. Am I missing any kind of key players there in Zimbabwe with like the main crops?
So corn is a staple. That's our staple. So corn is very important. Wheat is also important. Bread is also an important part of the diet. And then we also have legumes or different types of beans, with soybeans and sugar beans being some of the most important crops that we have. And then for more economic return on value type crops, we have tobacco. So that's important, and you've already mentioned that.
Between your bachelor's and your master's, you have listed that you worked as a regulatory affairs officer at the National Biotechnology Authority in Zimbabwe's capital. Tell us about that experience and how did that further advance you in your career path towards working in plant pathology?
Yeah, that was an interesting transition for me. So I had been mainly doing lab research, and this got me into an administrative position where, again, I got exposed to the end goal of what I'd been doing in my internship, GMO testing, where we were involved in regulation of genetically modified crops. I worked not only at national level, but also within the region. So the Southern African region, we sat with scientists, fellow scientists from there, discussing regulation, discussing ways of how to improve our testing methods, just so that we could identify some of those. And you might wonder why GMOs are important, but the larger market that we served did not want GMO product. And so just to make sure that we are catering for that and we're not having any contamination, that was something that we worked towards. So that was some of the work that I did with the National Biotechnology Authority.
Then you go to South Africa, where you pivot to working on the brown rust of sugarcane. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that disease in particular? It's important in sugarcane production. We've already talked about the fact that sugarcane is it's important crop in Zimbabwe. I don't know how important of a crop it is in South Africa. Obviously, they're close geographically, so I assume it's important there. But tell us about that pathosystem. How big of a problem is brown rust, and what did you study specifically on that?
So sugarcane is a pretty important crop to South Africa. They're one of the largest producers of sugarcane and resultant sugar. And sugarcane in South Africa is mainly produced on the eastern part of the country. So that's in KwaZulu-Natal. That's where you have a lot of the sugarcane farmers, and appropriately or aptly, the South African Sugarcane Research Institute is based in Durban. That's right close to the port as well. So that helps with logistics as far as export of the crop. Now, brown rust is important because it limits the yield of your sugarcane by massively impacting the leaves and reducing photosynthetic capacity. And so you have less yields. So that was the major disease that I worked on. And how I tried to help there was from the breeding side of things. And so we developed assays that would help us to identify cultivars and genotypes that were resistant to rust. And so we had a large collection at the South African Sugarcane Research Institute of germplasm collected from multiple locations all over the world. And our breeding team made crosses. And so we were able to characterize those crosses and the parents of those crosses and find plants that, or rather find cultivars and genotypes that were resistant to rust. So just from a traditional plant pathology side of things, we're able to help them with the identification of those for use in future bars of sugarcane that would be really the industry.
Now, I'm under the impression that this brown rust is not culturable. Is that correct?
Definitely, yeah. So that brings us to that whole obligate versus non-obligate situation, where your obligates, they need that host, and your non-obligates, they can grow in artificial media. And so for rust, like most basidiomycetes, it needs to grow on the sugarcane. And so we had to develop methods of multiplying our inoculum from single spores on detached leaves and then onto younger plants, just so that we had enough inoculum to test all those accessions and genotypes and cultivars that were coming from our project. So that was a lot of work, just understanding the different systems and trying to figure out how to make that happen.
Yeah, and I think it's a point worth bringing up here, because having worked with obligate biotrophs, there's so many barriers to successful experimental design and experimental outcomes. And to be able to do that and plan for all those setbacks or potential setbacks and still end up with the right amount of inoculum across all these different cultivars or lines that you're testing, There's just so many challenges. It's not for the weak at heart to work on these obligate biotrophic pathogens that require advanced rearing techniques, detached leaf or even attached leaf inoculum production. Definitely could appreciate all that. I actually spent some time in KwaZulu-Natal back in 2019. It's the only time I've ever visited South Africa, but I got a chance to go over there and touch the Indian Ocean. It's a beautiful spot. Was it strange to go from being landlocked to being on the ocean? Obviously, you grew up in the southern part of your country, and maybe it wasn't that far of a commute to get to the ocean, but did you fall in love with the ocean being there? And
I fell in love with the ocean. I had not seen that much water before, so just being there was amazing. And I was very fortunate that the research institute that I worked at and helped me get my master's degree, that was actually located right close to the beach. So it was really easy and convenient for me to go to the beach when I just need to unwind or de-stress. I discovered that calming nature of waves crashing. So it was an amazing experience. The cuisine was very different. Unfortunately, I'm allergic to shellfish, so I can't partake of everything, but definitely I fell in love with seafood as well, at least what I could consume. So that was something very different.
And that kind of brings us to your next stop along your own career trajectory. You went from the eastern shore of South Africa to Delaware, right? How did that come about? That's an interesting kind of to go from there to end up with Nicole and the University of Delaware. Is there a story there?
Yeah, there's a story. And whilst I was at the South African Sugarcane Research Institute doing my research, we started looking for resistance genes to brown rust. And I started encountering a lot of sequencing technology and related bioinformatics that came with that kind of data, the sequencing data.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that, I went for a course in the UK at the University of Cambridge, where I got to learn a little bit more about analysis of that data, got to see how other people were using that data, and got to experience what their research was like. And that was motivating in itself. But someone there happened to tell me, hey, there's someone in Delaware looking for someone who's got an interest in this kind of work. I was intrigued, and I reached out to Nicole and Tom Evans, and Tom immediately got back to me. I got talking to both of them, and within a couple of months, I was accepted at UD, and I was getting ready to move continents.
Oh, wow. That's great. And just shows you participating in some of these like workshops. They really are networking events, because you go there and then you hear about this position in Delaware and you end up there just a couple months later. That's wonderful. What I like about your career path and seeing you present over at the Potomac Division meetings over the years is that it seems that you're a very well-rounded scientist with this love of field-based work, but a real curiosity when it comes to the molecular biology. There's always been this interest in technology and bioinformatics and molecular data. Do you see yourself as more one than the other? Or do you think that you have one foot in as a field pathologist and plant scientist and the other foot in the other area? And how do you see yourself, the kind of scientist you are, changed over your career?
Thanks for that acknowledgement, Matt. Appreciate it. I like to see myself more as both and see the field evolving into something where you need to have decent aptitude in both fields. So being able to understand the molecular level and seeing how it translates in a field or greenhouse or growth chamber environment, I think those things are key. So when I came to the US, I had more of a field biology-based strength more than molecular. And I'd only just started getting my feet wet in the molecular field and working more closely with bioinformatics. So as I did my PhD at the University of Delaware, I worked closely with one of my co-advisors, Randall Weiser. He was a geneticist, a plant geneticist. And so he helped me to understand a lot about the technologies that were available at that moment, high throughput sequencing, reduced sequence representation methods, the analysis of those copious amounts of data and how to interpret it and put it across in a way that was understandable and would be able to give us the most impact. I believe I started to get more rounded during my PhD and start to understand more from both areas, so both field and the computational molecular side of things.
And I think the same thing happened to me. It's that I came from small institutions and I worked my way up to bigger institutions, and these smaller institutions didn't have quite the funding for all these like expensive molecular kind of, if you think about modern day like genomics and comparative genomics and things like that cost money. Not as much money as it used to cost, but it's maybe more straightforward to set up a field experiment and follow it for 6 months or 4 months and take it out and evaluate that data. But I think over the course of your PhD, you start to look around and say, oh, I need both skill sets. Or maybe your advisor pushes you in one direction to say, look, you are strong in this area, and I think you should develop skills in this area. That's maybe our job as mentors to do that. From an industry perspective, I'm curious, do you think that your employer and other industry employers are looking for people like you that really identify as both things because they can understand the whole process from field to gene? And do you think that's an important skill set that industry employers are looking for?
Definitely. I think that's something that's important here because in as much as right now I do a lot more of the pathology work in my current role, having an understanding of the molecular aspects helps you to be a better collaborator with everybody else. And so when you're in industry, unlike in grad school where you're seeing only a small piece of the project, in industry you're seeing the entire piece. And so you're working with not just other plant pathologists or molecular biologists, but now you have to work with toxicologists, you have to work with different types of chemists, a lot of people with different expertise. And so as you work with those people, just having an understanding of the work that they're doing and having an understanding of how you can add value to the entire project by complementing some of that work, I think is very useful. So I think that's something that is key. But also coming from grad school as well, we tend to bring fresh ideas that can help to refresh how things go. So it's always important to have a good handle on both sides.
Certainly. I think that's a really good point. So your current role is Senior Global R&D Scientist at FMC Agricultural Solutions. What does that job entail? I could probably take apart that title and figure out what you do. And I know you a little bit, so I know what you do. But I think there may be people listening, early career scientists that are saying, hey, I've heard good things about working for industry. It's nice to hear a perspective of someone that's in the industry and what their job actually entails and maybe how that ties into what you learned during your PhD. I'd love to hear whatever aspect of that you're willing to share.
Yeah, sure. So what I like about this role and what the role entails is a really dynamic work environment. And so not every day is the same. We have scheduled activities, but apart from those, everything else is pretty dynamic. And that allows you to be, for lack of a better word, entertained whilst you're at work. And so what that means is you might have an assay that you run every week or twice a week, but then you also have different problems that will come to you. And just looking at the job that I have, we have small projects that may or may not become a product. And so you're working on those projects and each of those have a different dynamic. It might be physical properties of a chemical that give you a challenge in terms of testing and you have to overcome those. Or it could be something else that might be related to the molecular side of things and you need to get a better handle on that to understand some basics there that allow you to proceed with the research. So there are all sorts of challenges. And as I've grown in that role, working on the discovery side where we're just looking at molecules go through the system and promoting them in terms of priority and seeing areas of chemistry grow into something promising, we do have different areas that we work on. So I've worked in the high throughput areas, I've worked in some upper level screening areas. And as I've grown in my career, I've taken on more responsibilities. So working with the external partners, engaging a lot more with students. And so that's involved some work that I do with the University of Delaware and Delaware State University. Responsibilities grow as you advance in your career and become more experienced at what you're doing. So you start to branch out a little bit more and gain different types of experience.
Absolutely. And with that comes leadership and overseeing people below you, having teams working under you. So you've been with FMC since 2018?
So this is my 6th year. I celebrated my 5th anniversary last year.
Okay. So 6 years in, what's something about industry that you maybe didn't know going into the job that you've learned since that you found interesting or just unexpected that maybe people thinking about going into industry might be insightful? Is there something that kind of surprised you about working in industry compared to being in academia? Obviously, they're very different.
I think the collaborations, that was eye-opening for me. I didn't imagine having that many collaborations with so many people from diverse scientific areas. That was something that was very interesting and has helped me to grow as a scientist. So just having those collaborations, learning about collaborations between organizations. So that was another thing as well. We're just seeing how organizations work together and being involved in that. That was something that was really rewarding, just being able to work on something that no one else has seen before and knowing that this might become a project as you work. But another thing that I've learned too is that in industry, sometimes you have to let go of a project, as exciting as it might be. Sometimes it doesn't go the way that you expect, and you don't linger. We're quick. We like to fail fast. So that was a big learning that I had.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Does that also apply to an interesting outcome that is not compatible with moving forward? It's not necessarily a failure, but it's just like an interesting result that might raise some curiosity, but you can't use that to motivate your way forward. It comes down to, if you're going to invest dollars in something, it has to be able to pay off, right?
Yeah. And in cases like that's where your ability to keep secrets is tested. You have this thing that you know, and that's all. It ends there. So sometimes you have really surprising outcomes, but they're not viable from both a grower perspective and from an organizational perspective. And so you have to let go.
So that kind of leads me down into this. I think there's some subconsciously inaccurate views of industry by a lot of people, myself probably included at some point in time. Some might say, we'll have these kind of generalizations like, oh, if you go into industry, you can't publish, which is probably like true in certain aspects because there's proprietary information that goes into developing a product. But at the same time, I assume that you can still publish. It's just like you can't publish certain things. Do you want to speak to that?
It's a field where you have to learn how to have delayed gratification. You find out the most spectacular fungicide. So I'm more fungicide, right? Spectacular fungicide, but you have to keep quiet and keep working on it up until you release a patent. And so those are things that happen. So you find that when it comes to publications, people publish papers later on in their careers or later on in a project that they're working on, when everything is now out there. And publications come in different forms, and you'll find people who have publications in the form of patents. People will have publications in the form of peer-reviewed journal articles, like way after a product is out there. And so they'll now be talking a lot more about the specifics, and you'll see a lot of that type of publication out there. There are different ways that people stay publishing and continue to be relevant from an academic standpoint. So it's not just being in industry and not being able to get your work out there. You do get your work out eventually.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a really good point that maybe you didn't articulate well, and it's worth mentioning, is that I think in academia, we put publications up on the pedestal. We're like, oh, peer-reviewed publications are the most important deliverable. In industry, the patent is the most important deliverable. And those patents can be lucrative, obviously, for the company that support their innovation, but also for the discoverer or the scientist who helped lead that project forward. And that idea of delayed gratification is also an important one, because sometimes when you're working on big stories, even in an academic lab, it could take a while to piece it all together. And sometimes you do publish papers along the way because it's better for storytelling, or it just makes more sense in terms of how you report things. But other times you may need all the components before you can release the story. And that seems to align with what you're telling me for industry. That's really interesting. The other thing that I think about in terms of the general inaccurate kind of stereotype of how we look at industry is that we see industry as a monolith. It's, there's industry jobs, but there's many different industries related to plant pathology. And I'm sure FMC fits a couple of those different holes with regard to the roles they serve and the needs they serve. Could you explain a little bit about the different types of industries in and around plant pathology and where your company fits in? Clearly, fungicide development is one. And I think that's the one that I'm most familiar with because, one, I've seen your work, but I also have seen where grad students work in labs that partner with these companies to independently assess the efficacy of novel products and compare them to conventional controls or past formulated products. But what are some of the other industries or some of the other products that FMC work on to develop and improve plant health?
So in terms of other industries, there are quite a lot of industries that are available out there, or at least industry type positions that are available there for someone who's recently graduated. And so you'll find that regulatory work is a good example of that. So we have our own regulatory teams here, but you find that the EPA will also have an arm where they look for people who have that kind of expertise. You find that people are also looking for patent people and someone who's able to read patents, and you go through a whole process for that as well, using your expertise. So someone who has knowledge of the field and can read some of those documents, those are things that are important. So being a patent agent or a patent attorney, that's one way. And a lot of organizations, they look for those. The government also does look for those as well. And then you also find that you have some organizations that might be divorced from crop protection, but they're trying to get into crop protection. And so they're looking for people who can do that kind of work. And you also have consultants as well. Mm-hmm. And so consultants come in different forms. So it can be people who are looking to get someone who's got expertise on diseases or expertise in identifying fungi or oomycetes for those purposes. So those are different areas and different flavors of industries around us where people can go outside of just chemical companies.
But when thinking about like from the plant side or the pathogen side, do you have a good mix of people working there that basically came from more of the plant breeding side versus the pathogen biology, pathogen ecology side? Do you have a good mix of those types of people working in your company in general? Or are there more, some of the industry are really plant-based, and there's some of the industry which are really more targeting the pathogen base, so you tend to have more pathogen-centric companies and more plant-centric companies, or both?
Yeah. So you find that we have different needs, and you will need people who have expertise in all areas. So people who have expertise with the plant, so more propagation just to allow people to be able to test, but also people who understand a lot about the fungus itself, how it grows, the genetics, because they need to supply that for people to use. And so you find that different organizations are structured differently. So we are purely crop protection right now, whereas some companies also have seed. And so for those companies that have seed, they will also have different divisions or arms within their organization where they have people who are doing a lot of plant breeding based type of work. So supporting breeding using pathology.
I think it was interesting that you mentioned the regulatory side. It makes so much sense. I just overlooked it, that you would definitely have a subset of individuals at an individual company that would serve as liaisons between these federal and state regulators, so that you could file paperwork on time for getting them approved for use in state or at the federal level. Are those people that are hired in those positions, they probably have different backgrounds, but someone who is in plant pathology could go into work in the regulatory side of a company like yours, no?
It's possible. And a lot of times people gain that kind of experience within an organization. But also, if someone was interested in that, I think looking at professional organizations and people who teach on some of those regulations would be a good way to go for someone who's interested in regulation. So there are quite a few avenues that one can take to become a regulator.
I want to pivot and talk a little bit about industry academic partnerships. Of course, you mentioned in-state collaborations. You're based out of Delaware.
Yes.
And obviously, as an alum of the University of Delaware, you maintain partnerships there and other institutions there in state. Are academic institutions one of the main partners with industry for testing these types of new products, fungicides, or do you work with kind of independent companies that vet them too?
It's a mix. They can be independent contract research organizations or CROs who specialize in testing. And then also you have the collaborations that you can have. So it all depends on the strategy, the location, and the circumstances. But in terms of partnerships that we have as well with local universities or our neighbors, is we have not only academic partnerships, but we also have partnerships where we're looking to engage students, form those networks, give our insights and experience, just so that we can grow our future scientists and hopefully get some of those to stay. That's some of the collaborative work that we do with universities, so not just from a scientific standpoint.
One of the things that I've been really happy with the Potomac division of APS is that we have for a long time had pretty good partnerships with industry, and industry has been very supportive of the students and the student awards and things like that. And I think that there is this understanding of opportunities in industry because of those kind of partnerships and things like that. I think that's great. One of the things I've also learned in working on registration of biocontrol products is that there's a certain point that you can go up to as a kind of a researcher doing efficacy and host range testing. But as you move towards these higher level federal approvals, EPA approval and stuff, there's all these really specialized types of tests that you almost have to be like a specialized lab. I know, coming back to your early work with like snails, the test, the macroinvertebrates, what's the LD50 on these and certain things. It seems like you have to work with those really specialized labs to test those things, because most academic labs aren't set up for those kinds of specialized testing.
Yeah, definitely. And as you go later on in the development process, you actually have organizations that independently do the testing. And so they're actually organizations that are recommended to do certain types of testing. And that's GLP type labs that have to do some of that work.
I was interested to hear a little bit more about this Healthy Foods for Healthy Kids NGO that you're a part of. Is that something that you want to tell us about? Because it seems like a really worthwhile organization, and I wanted to give you a chance to tell us a little bit more about it if you're interested.
Oh yeah, definitely. I came across this organization through my former manager. She sat on that board and she thought I would make a good addition to the organization. So she invited me to a board meeting. I sat through it and I fell in love with what they were trying to do. And so right now, we're trying to get a garden in every school in the state, and we're using those gardens as tools to teach science and nutrition. And we have a specialized program that is delivered by the organization to educators or teachers that they can use to teach students. So that's a state-approved curriculum there that we've developed. So it's a lot going on, and some of the work that I put into that organization is helping with strategy. I contribute with some data analysis skills that I have to try and get information on how the organization is doing, just so that we can inform our strategy a little bit better. So that's basically what the organization does. It's a Delaware-based organization, and we're always happy to get funding from whoever as the organization is growing. So we have almost 60 schools at this point and growing. So any support that we can get would be greatly appreciated.
No, that's wonderful. So earlier we were talking about geography and Southern Africa and where Zimbabwe sits relative to South Africa and Botswana and Zambia and Mozambique. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, you had mentioned earlier how we share a border with South Africa. So we share a border with South Africa, and that's actually one of the busiest borders in the region. But we also share borders with Botswana on the west. We share borders with Mozambique on the east and Zambia on the north. But we also have an interesting border. It's called the Caprivi Strip, or Caprivi, basically. And that is a border where we have 4 countries that all share a border, like a small point. So that the countries that share that border: Namibia, Botswana, Angola, Zambia, and us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so 4 other countries. So that's an interesting little fact about Zimbabwe. And that spot is right close to Victoria Falls. So if you go to Victoria Falls, you have the chance to go stand in 5 countries at almost the same time.
So does the falls cut through that exact intersection of the 5, or does each country claim part of the falls? How does that work?
The falls are a little bit east of that spot, but the falls are shared between Zambia and Zimbabwe. So you can see them from Zimbabwe. You have a good view from Zimbabwe, but you can also see them from Zambia.
And that's one of the geographic highlights of Zimbabwe.
Absolutely. It's amazing. It's breathtaking.
I want to give you an opportunity to talk about something maybe that wasn't brought up that you'd like to talk about. So is there something that you felt like you wanted to talk about that we didn't cover?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the value of networking and keeping those networks and connections alive.
Sure.
And so with that, I'd like to say thank you to a lot of people who've helped me on my journey, both professional and personally. And so you have so many people. My path to South Africa was through a friend. His name is Tendekai. He works for the South African government now. And he introduced me to my industry advisor, or my academic advisor at South African Sugarcane Research Institute, Stuart Rutherford. And he took us in and we did some amazing work there. And Stuart encouraged me to continue working hard and to understand bioinformatics a lot more. And so that's how I got that opportunity to go to England and meet people who told me about the University of Delaware and the recent grant that they'd gotten at that point for lima bean. Huge grant for the department. So I got to be a part of that. And as I was at the University of Delaware, just going for school, going for tours, industry tours, events like conferences where you can network and communicate with people is very important. And that's how I met my now colleagues when we came to, the site was a DuPont site at that time. I came here and I met the team that I work with now back then. And some of them remembered me from that tour. It was a good reminder of how important networking and keeping those networks alive is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for some of us, and having seen you present at APS Potomac Division when you were a PhD student and talked to you at the meeting a couple of years, at least your personality at the meeting is very extroverted. You're easy to talk to. You seem to enjoy talking to people. Not everyone has that experience. They're introverted, and it's a little harder for them to network because they might have a fear of engaging in conversations. I'm not one of those people. I characterize myself as explosively extroverted. I like talking to people, but it does pay off to go to meetings and talk to people. Maybe you don't want to talk to a lot of people. Maybe that's outside your comfort zone, but it does still pay to go to meetings and present your work and talk.
Absolutely. And when you go to these meetings, they usually have a list out there of who's there. If you have certain interests and you see someone who might help you to advance those interests, maybe a little bit more information or a lead to research or a job, it's always good. Look through that list and approach them, especially if you don't want to approach too many people. And I'm extroverted. I always think I'm an introvert. And I was with a friend recently and he was like, I see you talk to a lot of people, like you were never like this in high school. And I was like, I feel like I'm still introverted. Again, it's just understanding where you are and what you need to do. You might be introverted, but there are times where it's good to try to get out there a little bit.
I think one of the unique aspects of networking with industry folks like yourself or in teams that are specifically there for networking is that often you'll find booths where certain industry partners are providing information, but they're there specifically to meet students and talk with them. They have a booth in free goods. They're like, come get your free conference pen, come get your bag. We want to talk to you. We want to look for the next generation of scientists to hire. So I think it's even easier because they set up a booth that says, please come visit us. We want to talk to you.
Yeah, and we give away like really useful stuff whenever we've got a booth or anything, or like anyone from industry. Feel free, just go out there and talk to them. You never know. We gave out job description flyers the last time with APS, and we have 3 associates here that we got from that conference in Pittsburgh. It was useful for us and for the students as well. So definitely, like, it's a symbiotic relationship. So take part.
Great. It's been wonderful talking to you, and I really appreciate your willingness to meet with us. I'm excited to have your perspective be shared with the larger plant health community and our listenership, because certainly you bring a unique perspective as a person from industry who came up through the same kind of plant pathology training we came through. Thank you for your time, and it's been wonderful talking to you.
Yeah, definitely. I had one more thing that I wanted to talk about too.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So in terms of work-life balance, I want to talk about that. Yeah. So I think it's always important to find an organization and a role that will allow you to have that work-life balance. And it's key when it comes to your mental well-being, how you deliver at work, just having that time to unwind and be with people that you love. So in my case, like my family, I'm grateful to my family. They're always there behind me. When I go home, I know I'm going home to a supporting environment and something fun to do. I've got calls from home in Zimbabwe, like motivating me. So just having that work-life balance and appreciating other things outside work allows you to come back re-energized and ready to bring the next best product to the world.
Yeah, that's a great point. And something that I've talked about with other guests, and I've talked about myself when I've been guest on other podcasts as well as this one, is that work-life balance. I think it's really easy, younger and have a lot more energy to be like, oh, I can work 15 hours a day for 30 days straight. But that's not a healthy habit. It's not good for your mental health. But it's also, from the academic standpoint, you're not going to be rewarded for that. Yeah, you might get an extra publication out, but if you set yourself up that you have to work that hard at a certain career stage, then you'll keep forcing yourself to work that hard throughout your whole career. And that's not sustainable over the long term. It's diminishing returns. After a certain point, working 18 hours a day, you're not going to come up with the best idea ever at 18 hours and 56 minutes. No, you're actually more likely if you're rested and you come in refreshed.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't want to get burnt out. Even here at work, when you got vacation days, you take them so that you come back and you're ready to tackle the next challenge.
I agree 100%. Terry, it's been wonderful talking to you, and thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate this opportunity.
We've just heard from Dr. Terence Mhora, Senior Global R&D Scientist at FMC Agricultural Solutions. As always, be sure to check out the show notes section immediately following the episode description for links related to Dr. Mhora's work. I'm Matt Kasson, host of Plantopia. Thanks for listening.